I stumbled upon this peer-reviewed article from 2016, which was a fantastic example about how DNA and historical narratives get braided together in a very intentional way. So this article is called Crossing Disciplinary Lines, Reconciling Social and Genomic Perspectives on the Histories and Legacies of the Transatlantic Trade in Enslaved Africans. It can be found in the journal New Genetics and Society. The first part of this paper walks through the limits of constructing consumer DNA panels, but the second part is interesting. It looks at how consumer ancestry reports are framed for the public. In this article, they do case studies on two specific companies related to specifically connecting African Americans to African DNA. Page 18, they discuss one of the ways that they are able to create the narratives for consumers. It states, it's worth noting that by Haywood and Thornton standards, the genetic results provided to the participants of African American lives and to African DNA customers could only be considered reliable and truthful if they were able to be placed within the specific historical context of the transatlantic slave trade in enslaved Africans. Although any exact genetic match with another individual correctly indicates biological descent from a common ancestor and therefore may logically be characterized by American genealogical conventions as signaling the two people are biologically related, they were only concerned if they were able to establish a connection between that African American person and an African. Literally, in their own words, by matching genetic anomalies in African American and an African, one can establish that these two individuals had a common ancestors 2 centuries ago. But the issue is that they weren't looking at all the anomalies across the data set. They were filtering only if it could be justified by the transatlantic slave narrative, which we just said. They also discuss how when Henry Louis Gates was filming, I guess, a show about African American lives, he had his own DNA reanalyzed. And if you can see right here, for the filming of the show, Gates' mtDNA was reanalyzed, and the results indicated, on the contrary, that the vast majority of haplotype matches were found in West Europe between Paris and Dublin. Kittles, who is the owner of the original DNA company, subsequently conceded that the latter result was more likely to be correct. So they essentially discounted any DNA that was not African because it didn't fit the central premise of the company, which was supposedly connecting African Americans to African DNA, which is quite concerning when you think about it, because that means that this person's identity was socially constructed. The people that were working at the company decided to discount the majority of his genetic signature and focus on something that supported their narrative. The article also discusses the role that historians play in constructing how the DNA results are going to be presented to consumers. Again, this is a case study that's just these two platforms discussed, but one could infer that this is probably how a lot of the consumer DNA companies that come up with different narratives about your DNA operate. It says, the role of the historians, therefore, would be to receive the names of tribes identified by the genetics team and create stories to explain how an individual from that tribe could possibly have gotten from Africa to America during the period of this transatlantic trade. So essentially, we've done two things. We've filtered out all DNA that cannot be supported within the concept of the transatlantic slave trade, and now we're bringing in historians to come up with potential migration patterns to discuss how the DNA would have gotten from Africa to America. So all constructed so far and limited. When that wasn't working, then they tried a different approach. And it says, this time, rather than starting with the genetic match in Africa and trying to create a stable historical narrative to fit, was to begin by analyzing the historical trade routes to the most common U.S. ports where captive Americans were disembarked, and then to work backwards from there to identify ports of origin in Africa. Using maps of the standard shipping patterns and trade routes between North America and different parts of Africa, they could discard outliers, genetic matches that fell too far from the ports habitually involved in the transatlantic slave trade, and instead hone in on regions and groups where the consumer's ancestor was more likely to have originated without necessarily pinpointing one specific tribe. So essentially what we're seeing here is two things. One, they were only framing the results that they could that they would report in terms of, does this match to a commonly known U.S. shipping port for slaves? So if the DNA fell outside of that, it was considered an outlier. And I know that I'm not the only person who has a lot of deep ancestry from the United States that just stops. That means that if these researchers were looking at your DNA profile, they're not even addressing your genealogical lines that stop in America. They're only looking at, was this line close to a port? If it was close to a shipping port, then they could somehow make up a migration path of how your ancestor ended up in the United States. But there isn't necessarily genetic proof that it happened the way they did. Again, they are applying the historical narrative and interpreting all the data through there. And if it didn't fit the narrative, it's considered an outlier and discarded. So this paper unintentionally raises a very important question. If the professionals in various industries are deciding that the data is only considered reliable if it fits the narrative, a specific narrative at that, then it erases how many layers of human history. By design, different perspectives in human ancestry, migration, anything else is automatically discounted because it doesn't fit the narrative that they're choosing to believe. So the story isn't in the data. The story is in what is being allowed to be considered true.